This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we'll be looking more closely at the Palestinian refugee experience in the 1950s. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome. This is now our 15th episode on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you'd like to start at the beginning, you can find an overview of the series on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. We also have a range of episodes on other topics, especially related to European history. We have episodes on the war in Ukraine, on the French and Russian revolutions, and even on the history of Christmas, something that might be particularly attractive right now as I record this in December 2024. It's all there, and you can find other information as well on our website, including reading recommendations and ways to support the show. Okay, let's get into it. In our last episode, we examined the question of what happened to the Palestinian state, or perhaps better put, Palestinian political institutions, in the aftermath of Israel's 1948 triumph in the First Arab-Israeli War. As we saw, these institutions either collapsed or were subsumed by the neighboring Egyptian and Jordanian states. We also discussed the ramifications of expulsion for the cultural idea of Palestinian nationhood, seeing how the shared trauma of the Nakbah actually provided a common experience that made the idea of Palestinian nationhood, that made the idea of thinking of oneself primarily as a Palestinian, as opposed to being Arab, as opposed to being from Nablus, as opposed to kind of a local identity, a religious identity, Christian, Muslim, that made the identity of being Palestinian more important and widely realized than it had ever been before. In today's episode, we want to shift our focus a little bit from abstract things like the notion of the nation to look more closely at the human side of the refugee experience in the 1950s. What was it like to be a refugee? What was it like to be someone who had refugees come to their community? How did individual Palestinians respond to the crisis, especially as the prospect of a return to their homeland grew dimmer and dimmer as we get into the mid-1950s? Unfortunately, we live in a time period today when the idea of refugees is not something that is unknown to us, right? If you follow politics, if you follow world events, you are very aware of the number of refugees that come here to the United States, whether they're political refugees from places like Venezuela or Cuba, economic refugees coming from South America, whether we're talking about, for example, in Europe with the Syrian civil war and people that are fleeing their homes, in many cases just because of the violence, places like Afghanistan, places like Iraq, places like Haiti. Right? We know very well, or at least at a surface level, we're very familiar with the concept of being a refugee. So what was this like for the global community in the 1950s? These are all issues that we're going to try to unpack in the course of today's episode. Now, before we get into details about the 1950s, I want to make one sort of fundamental point about the refugee experience. I just mentioned a whole bunch of different cases of refugees. I left out, obviously, talking about Gaza today. I left out talking about Ukraine. I left out talking about Myanmar, Sudan, right? There's so many of these different refugee experiences in terms of geographical context. As we talk about this subject, it is important to recognize that there is below the surface a variation of experiences of refugees, even within refugees coming from a single community. So if you look at a place like Ukraine today, and you think about refugees that fled at the very beginning of the war with Russia, some of those refugees are people that had their homes destroyed, that had their towns occupied, that literally had nowhere else to go, were kind of destitute in many ways, were dependent on the places that they went, on international aid associations. But some of them weren't. Some of the refugees that came from Ukraine at the very beginning of the war came from wealthy families, had connections in Europe, were able to go and drive their BMW across the border, stay at nice hotels, rent a place. And so the point that I'm making here is not a moral judgment about any of these refugees, right? To be a refugee is horrible. But it is that refugees then, as well as now, kind of had different experiences in terms of what it meant to be a refugee. Now, all of these refugees suffer from the problem of displacement. So we don't want to minimize that at all. But again, we want to emphasize that this process of becoming a refugee, of displacement, takes many forms. Not all refugee experiences were the same, even within the same geographic and political context. And this was also true in 1948. When we talk about the Nakbah, not everyone's experience with the Nakbah is the same. And it doesn't make it any less important. It doesn't mean that, well, some people suffered and others didn't, or it's not that big a deal. We're just trying to get at the heart of the refugee experience itself, which again, especially in 1948, there are lots and lots of different types of refugees and lots of refugee experiences. Some of the refugees that leave in 1948 come from well-off families, come from families that have connections in other places in the Middle East. Some of them will go to stay with relatives in places like Lebanon and Egypt. Some of them go to the West Bank, as we saw. And these refugees tend to have an easier transition to life outside of Palestine than some of them that don't. Those with highly sought-after skills, intellectuals, bankers, merchants, they are able to find and use resources that other refugees don't have in 1948. They are able to build new lives independently of the international community. They don't need the resources of someone else coming in and kind of helping them out over the long term. They are able to find sustenance for themselves. Now, as we'll see in a second, a lot of the refugees that leave Palestine or what becomes Israel in 1948, many of them come from an agrarian background. They're often described as, quote unquote, unskilled labor. Unskilled labor is kind of a misnomer because if you work on a farm, you do have skills. There are a lot of things that people know how to do on a farm that people living in cities don't know how to do, that people working in offices don't know how to do. The problem is a knowledge of animal husbandry, a knowledge of crops and rotations and pestilences related to plants that doesn't translate very well into the modern industrialized economy. These people get labeled as being unskilled laborers when it's really that they just have skills that don't translate well. And so a lot of times they're forced to sell their labor. They perform jobs like construction, jobs like being a janitor, cleaning services, childcare, elder care, jobs where you don't need a lot of technical skills to be able to do. A lot of these people, especially in 1948 in the Palestinian context, they're very poor. They're working on farms. They're not literate. They're not ready again for life in an urban society in a modern bureaucratized, industrialized society. And so these people in 1948 and afterwards are going to face a much more challenging path in terms of adjusting to the results of the war. A lot of the people that end up in the refugee camps, that end up kind of seeking support from the international community, these are people coming from an agrarian background, people that don't have skills, again, that translate well into the industrialized urban economy. One other thing just to say in terms of the variety of refugee experiences, sometimes it doesn't matter where you're from, sometimes it matters where you end up. Some of these refugees, particularly those that end up coming into Jordan, are welcomed by their host societies, get integrated to a larger degree or a much larger degree than they do in places like Egypt, places like Lebanon. Some of these refugees will wind up in the United States. And while you don't want to say that they're just, seamlessly integrated and there's, never any challenges, because part of the immigrant experience here to the United States is wrestling with a number of challenges. But it's pretty good to live in the United States. It's pretty good to get access to American schools and later on healthcare and especially the job market. And so again, a lot of these people will have very different experiences. It's hard to kind of summarize all in one, 5-minute block here what the extent of the refugee experience is like. Now again, none of this is meant to take away from the shared trauma of dispossession or displacement. To lose your home, to experience the shattering of your community, to be forced into exile. In some ways, it doesn't matter what your economic status is, where you wind up, what your job prospects are, right? To some extent, if you're a Syrian refugee and you wound up in Berlin and you're getting all this aid from the German government and your kids are going to have access to schools there, and really importantly, they're going to have access to the European labor market. In some ways, like, you have really landed in a very fortunate place, but it doesn't get rid of any of the trauma of exile, right? Any of the sorrow, the suffering, the sense of loss, the nostalgia and the yearning to go back home. And if you look at certain examples of Palestinian literature, such as Ghassan Kanafani's 1969 novella Return to Haifa, or the more recent fictional work by Susan Abulhawa called Mornings in Jenin, or even Edward Said's 1979 The Question of Palestine, you can really get a clear sense of the psychological experience of being a refugee. Right? Whether you're saying this is based on your direct experiences of being a refugee, as Edward Said was, for example, as a number of Palestinian authors were, or whether you're basing that on the collective idea. Right? So maybe you're not a first-generation Palestinian who experienced the Nakbah directly. Maybe you're the child of people that went through that, but you've grown up in a community that talks about it constantly, that expresses it constantly. Right? So there is a lot out there in terms of the psychological side of the refugee experience, and of course, again, this idea of displacement. Now, for us in this podcast today, to get a better sense of the situation, we're going to focus on specific geographic context rather than individual experiences. And I'm going to do this for two reasons. One, as I just said, there are so many different refugee experiences. I could talk for an hour about Edward Said, but Edward Said's experience is not the same as a farmer from Jenin, as a tailor from Nablus, as someone that winds up in Lebanon versus Egypt versus Jordan versus working in the Iraqi oil fields. So to kind of focus on one or two individuals, I don't think that really helps us get the overview of the situation, and I think that's what we really want to focus on right now. As I said, if you're interested in the psychological side of things, there are a number of works that you can read, especially, you just Google Palestinian literature. There's plenty of stuff in there about the experience of expulsion, of exile, of suffering and trauma and loss. The second reason, too, is just I think we have some idea of what it means to be a refugee today. Again, if I just say the word refugee, I say close your eyes, think about it. What is that experience like? What is the image in your mind? It's not that hard for us to get that kind of image because we have so much of it in the world today. Now, that doesn't mean that we can understand what it's like unless you've actually been a refugee yourself. That's a whole different ballgame. But I'm just saying at the surface level, most of you understand the concept of a refugee, can kind of imagine fairly easily what some of the challenges are that refugees might face. And so given the time limitations today, we're going to proceed geographically instead of looking at individuals. We're going to talk about the refugee experiences in three different geographic or political contexts. And that's Gaza, and then Jordan, and then Lebanon. And you'll get a better sense of what I mean here when we talk about the variety of refugee experiences as I talk about the different ways that those refugees were treated in the different societies that they wound up in. And then, as I said at the end, we'll talk about the international community and how they kind of viewed the situation. Okay, let's start by talking about Gaza, because Gaza is obviously in the news a lot today. There are hundreds of thousands of new Palestinian refugees, so it seems like the kind of good place to start our discussion. When the Civil War broke out in November of 1947, the Gaza Strip that we refer to so much today did not actually exist, at least as a geographical term, as a kind of political unit, if you will. It's just not really there. Rather, it's basically part of a larger Gazan region that was supposed to be divided between Jews and Arabs by the 1947 partition resolution. Now, in this territory, the northern part, which was more populous, that was supposed to be awarded to Israel, and the smaller, southern, more rural part was supposed to be awarded to what would become Palestine. And as those of you who have followed the conflict in the Middle East know, this territory in the south is not very big. Right? This is about 5 miles deep, and it runs about 28 miles down the coastline. Today, of course, it has one of the highest population densities anywhere in the world. Sometimes you'll hear commentators refer to Gaza as being a prison because it is so small and there are so many people. And as we'll see in just a moment, you can't just leave Gaza if you want to. Now, back at the time of the first Arab-Israeli War, there were only about 80,000 people living in Gaza. So that's still a lot. There were still some, sort of crowded areas, but that is much, much different than the population of Gaza today. Today, about 10 times that number of people live in Gaza, or at least did before the start of the war with Israel. Now, as violence spiraled into war in 1948, this southern half quickly became a destination for refugees that were obviously fleeing the fighting, especially in urban or mixed areas, Haifa or later on Jaffa, which gets kind of cleared out in part of the ethnic cleansing operations. About half of the refugees that arrive in Gaza come from the northern part, and about 42% come from Lida, or Lod as it's called today in Hebrew. If you've ever been to Israel, the main airport into Israel is Ben Gurion Airport. It's just outside of Tel Aviv. And so Lida is a little bit south of where that airport is. Now, estimates range as to how large this migration was during the war. These estimates go from about 80,000 people on the low side to about 250,000 people on the high side. Again, if you think about it, these are people leaving in the middle of a conflict. There's a war going on. They don't, have ID cards where they just check off, okay, I'm a refugee, I'm leaving. Right? It's very hard to count the populace as the population is in motion. And this is something we'll see is actually a huge problem for the international community. As you're trying to respond to this issue, how do you do so when there's not a way of really tracking who is where and what their need is? We do, however, have the results of a hard census that was taken in December of 1949. And this established the number of refugees at 202,000. So remember, there were about 80,000 people in Gaza before the war. Now, all of a sudden, we're going to add over 200,000 people without really building any new infrastructure, without building more bridges, roads, giving new jobs, hospitals. And think about the effect that that's going to have on the local population. Moreover, when we're talking about the refugees that go to Gaza, these are not the bankers from Jerusalem. If you are fairly well off, no matter what part of what becomes Israel you're from, you're not going to go to Gaza, which is kind of the poor area. You're going to go to Egypt. You're going to go to Jordan. You're going to go to Amman, the capital of Jordan. You might go to Beirut, right? But you're not going to go to the poor rural area. The people that are going to go there are mostly poor peasants from small villages of less than 2,500 people. When they do this survey in December of 1949, 65% of the refugees are classified as unskilled laborers. So these are people that are coming again from farms, but there's no extra farms in Gaza. More dauntingly, over 90% of these refugees that arrive in Gaza are illiterate. And so you take people that are in a situation where they have immense need, there's a lot of poverty, they don't have a lot of resources, and now you're bringing them to a region that is itself not really that well off. Gaza has a couple sort of towns, they're not quite cities in 1948. They don't have a lot of money, there's not a lot of resources, trade. To the extent that there is trade, where the major places people from Gaza trade with, it's Jaffa and Tel Aviv, which now happen to fall on the other side of the border. So the experience of the refugee crisis isn't just about the Palestinians who leave what then becomes the state of Israel. It's also about the Palestinians that were living in Gaza at the time. When you have a large number of people that show up and they don't have jobs, and the skills that they have are mainly physical skills, or that's what they have to kind of sell, well, all of a sudden your labor market explodes because you got a massive supply of labor and very little demand for it. If you're someone that was an agricultural worker, your wages are going to go down dramatically if you lived in Gaza before the war, because all of a sudden there's all these other people out there that will work for less. You think about the prices of something like food, all of a sudden there's all these more mouths to feed. It's not like there's more extra food there. And so basically, within months, the entire region basically becomes dependent on foreign aid in order to sustain itself. Now, in many cases, the initial wave of refugees, just as they do in almost every kind of refugee context, they adjust to the situation in the best ways that they can. Imagine if there was some kind of natural disaster, you don't have state resources to come and supply temporary housing. Where are you going to live? Where are you going to get food from? And so the first wave of refugees is basically dependent on the local population. And even though there are sort of hardships that are coming, the local population, generally speaking, understood what was going on, understood the massive need, and reached out to their fellow Palestinians and tried to supply them with whatever help that they could give them. We're talking about food. You're sharing food with a complete stranger. In terms of shelter, what are the types of places where there's a roof, but there isn't always already somebody living there? You're talking about places like mosques. You're talking about abandoned houses. You're talking about schools, churches. And so as this wave of refugee increases, desperation drives people to basically live wherever they can. Eventually, you'll get some tent cities that start to rise up. The problem with tent cities is you don't really have a lot of tents just naturally in Gaza. And so in the very beginning, a lot of people are just living in these kind of basic mud and stick structures. Some people just live on the street. There isn't anywhere to go. Everywhere is occupied. Again, imagine, take your town and add 4 times the number of people or 3 times the number of people to your town. Where do they all go? Where do they all live? Of course, this fighting begins in the winter of 1947. It rolls into the first Arab-Israeli War and gets into the summer of 1948 and kind of continues in some ways into the winter of 1948. So in Gaza, for example, food and fuel become incredibly scarce. Refugees literally just walk around looking for anything that's made of wood, anything that I can burn. And so it is an incredible sense of desperation that characterizes the Palestinian refugees who wind up in Gaza in 1948. Now, as I mentioned, the most immediate source of aid to the refugees is the local population itself, which again donates food, donates clothing. One of the biggest sort of problems that you have is milk for babies, right? We're talking about an entire society that's being driven out. Well, there's always women that are pregnant. There's always young babies, especially you go back 100 years ago, families were much bigger. But if the mom's not getting enough food, the mom isn't going to be making enough milk to pass on to her child. And so again, the local population, women that were pregnant that already had enough food or that were getting enough nourishment, like they're reaching out and they're trying to help these refugees as best they can. Now, the international community does respond to this, but by September 1948, the UN has started collecting supplies. These will come from as many as 16 different countries. The Egyptian army will also do what it can. Remember, the Egyptian army is in the middle of a war with Israel at this point, but they will give tents, they will give food, they will try to help out the local population. But basically, as the number of refugees continues to increase, the relief efforts, the ad hoc idea of trying to respond to this crisis, it's not enough. By mid-November 1948, supplies of flour and rice are beginning to run out, and the International Red Cross estimates that about 10 children die of starvation every day in Gaza. Again, this is 1948. 10 children per day are dying in Gaza from starvation. Now, there's a little more context that we can add to this, right? 1947-48, the harvests, especially in Europe, are very poor. Globally speaking, resources, it's a very constrained time period. You also are starting to have people coming into Israel from other parts of the Middle East. So Israelis have their own kind of economic crisis going on. But again, that figure is just, it's harrowing, it's heartbreaking. It's not hard to understand the sense of pain and outrage that Palestinians have about this moment in time because the suffering is extraordinary. Now, the UN, as we'll see, does a number of things. One of the things that they try to do is they contract with the American Friends Service Committee, which is probably easier known as the Quakers, to start bringing assistance to Gaza. And so the Quakers actually do this relatively quickly. They start bringing in a steady stream of supplies. They bring them into the Egyptian port of Port Said. It's about 200 miles away. So you can bring the aid, but then trying to figure out how do we distribute this? How do we get it to the people in the camps? How do we ensure that there's not riots? Those of you that follow the situation in Gaza today, you know that the need of the people is very dire. But one of the problems is you can't just show up with an aid truck and say, okay, we're going to unload some food for some people, because people are so desperate. People want that aid. And even some of the people that are less desperate want the aid because they know it's unbelievably valuable. So you hear stories about aid convoys disappearing, trucks being hijacked. And it's easy to sit here and say, well, people are being immoral. They shouldn't be. But in a moment of crisis, in a moment when people are desperate, you're talking about the question of life and death. Most people will do whatever they can to survive. Getting back to 1948, one of the things that authorities do to try to help alleviate this situation is that they will begin to organize people into camps. The Egyptian military, for example, identifies 11 areas on the outskirts of the area's major towns and turns them into refugee camps. They start to figure out, how do we set up a regular distribution system so that people know that they're going to get their rations of flour or bread or salt or milk, and they don't have to try to fight over a delivery that's coming in. The UN in particular focuses on donating dry milk, right? So we can make it into milk, get it to those babies. Later on, they will start focusing on things like corrugated iron, because if we're going to build something more temporary than a mud hut, I need iron. I need something that is stronger, that's not going to fall apart, something that might even be insulated a little bit for the winter, something that's going to be insulated a little bit for the summer. These life-saving efforts are, of course, heroic. And it's easy to sit back and criticize them, just as it is now. It's easy to say, well, there should be more done. Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? But just to give you an idea of some of the challenges that aid workers face as they're trying to try to deal with this situation. One of the most difficult things is, how do I know how many people are there? How do I know how many people actually need supplies? Refugee populations are not static. Refugees don't just leave a place and say, okay, I'm planting my flag here. Come hell or high water, I'm just going to deal with the circumstances here. No, if there's not enough resources, they will keep moving until they find a place where there are resources, where there is the idea of shelter, of regular food or something like that. You also, of course, have this going on during the Arab-Israeli war. And as we talked about in our episode on that, the Arab-Israeli war isn't just, okay, fighting and then it stops. There are a lot of armistices. Even when the armistices are there are occasional violations of that. You have ethnic cleansing operations that are carried out by Israel in between when there's some of those pauses. And so the population moving through these areas, again, it's not static. It's always fluid. So how do I know how many people are there? How do I know how much food, how much medicine I need to get to these places? Another problem that they have to deal with is that the refugees are not a coherent group. Even though they identify as Palestinian, they are not all on the same team. They are not all thinking in terms of collective belonging and collective survival. One of the unfortunate statistics and the unfortunate realities that happened with the Syrian crisis that happened in 2015, the Syrian civil war, right, a lot of refugees. You heard these amazing statistics about the percentages of women that were raped or assaulted on their way to Europe. And these percentages were unbelievably high, right? Almost every woman experiences some form of harassment, some form of being groped, maybe a man making a kind of pass at her, maybe even rape. It's again quite common. And it's not only the local populations where this is happening in places like Turkey and Greece, it is also members of the refugees themselves, young men, maybe older men. In the Gazan context, we don't really hear a lot about rape, but one of the biggest problems, which again complicates this question of how do we figure out how many people are here, is that when a registered refugee dies, the family does not always come forward and say, oh, Samir died. We feel awful about it, obviously. It's tragic. We're horrified. We got to have a funeral. You can take his ration card back. Right? In many cases, families trying to survive, even if their loved ones pass away, they will not report that because they want to keep getting the food, because if they don't get the food, they might die. And so from a bureaucratic standpoint, trying to calculate the amount of food, the amount of aid that's needed becomes this kind of, in a sort of a sick way, a game almost, of trying to guess what is the need, how many people are being honest about the number of people there, how many people have left, right, just of their own volition, how many people have died. And so it just makes the bureaucratic process of trying to calculate the aid need incredibly difficult. A third problem going on here that's going to complicate everything is that when you are talking about Palestinians in Gaza in the 1950s, you are really talking about two different groups. You are talking about these refugees who, again, have this incredible need, but you're also talking about local Palestinians who were in Gaza before 1947, who also now have tremendous need because all of a sudden there's 3 times as many people living there. In terms of what the aid agencies understand their mission to be, helping that family that came from Lida to survive is paramount. Helping the family that was already in Khan Yunis, that's not part of my job description. If I'm going to start taking care of all the local people in addition to the refugees, well, now my, mission just got even harder. Now it's even more incredibly difficult. But how do you go to a family in Khan Yunis and you say, well, the dad used to be involved in agriculture, but the dad lost his job because there's so many other people here now, and the family is destitute, the family is starving, the family couldn't afford their rent, so they got kicked out of their dwelling. And then they go and they say, wow, I need help, I'm destitute. And the aid agency says to them, well, I'm sorry, you're not a refugee, so you're not eligible for it. It is a horrible, horrible situation all around. But the local population is not awarded aid, at least in 1949. And so, as you might expect, while the initial reaction is predominantly one of understanding, one of welcoming, one of assistance, there are also tensions that arise between the refugees and the local population. The good news is that by the early spring of 1949, these international aid efforts increased dramatically, and the situation began to get slightly better. The Turkish government, for example, donates about 2,000 tents, and in the summer of 1949, they're able to supply an additional 10,000 tents. As food supplies become standardized, most refugees, not all, but most, receive about 1,500 calories per day. Now, this is not a very high level. If you're someone that follows kind of caloric intake guidelines, Right now in the United States, the average man is supposed to eat between 2,000 and 2,400 calories per day. So you're below the amount of calories you should have, but you're not starving anymore. They will begin to build new hospitals. The Church Mission Society opens a hospital dedicated exclusively for refugees. The Egyptian Red Crescent will sponsor another hospital. And this sounds good. You have about 150 beds that are now going to be open for refugee patients. And then again, of course, you put that in perspective and you're talking about a population of over 200,000 people. 150 beds are not going to go very far for a population of 200,000 people. As time goes by, authorities also begin to recognize that the question is not just keeping people alive, but you have to give them a future. And in particular, the children are sort of time sensitive in terms of you need to give these kids an education now. You can't wait for 5 or 6 years and then go back and say, okay, we're going to do basic arithmetic. And so another area where the refugees start to see a lot of investment is in the field of education. By the spring of 1949, 16,000 refugee children will start to be put into schools. You will have hundreds of volunteer teachers coming from Egypt. These volunteer teachers step into a situation where there is not necessarily a classroom, or certainly not a modern classroom. They don't have blackboards. They don't have primers. They don't have books. You can imagine being one of these volunteers and you kind of, not literally parachute in, but you kind of metaphorically parachute in. You're ready to hear, you're ready to help the kids, and just walk into a classroom and there's no supplies. There's no books. There's no paper. There are no pens and pencils, no chalkboard. An unbelievably daunting challenge, especially for those first wave of people involved in trying to deal again with the refugee crisis. Now, gradually, this situation will be improved. You will get donations from the international community, not just in the Middle East, from places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Iraq, but you'll get books from London, maps from Norway, as we mentioned, tents coming in from Egypt. I mentioned the idea of futures a second ago. The children aren't the only one that need a future. Obviously, all of these people living in the camps also need a future. They need jobs. They need something to do all day. And so relief agencies will also start focusing in Gaza on constructing vocational schools. They begin to teach refugees how to weave and spin cloth. The United Nations will provide funding for the construction of a textile factory. They'll start to build laundry facilities, bathing facilities. And this isn't just about, well, obviously you have hundreds of thousands of people. They would like to be able to bathe. It's hygienic. But it's not just about increasing the comfort of the refugees. A lot of this becomes about basically creating construction jobs. You got to build all this stuff. You got a big supply of quote unquote unskilled labor that's just sitting around, needs something to do. Building infrastructure becomes one path either out of the situation or at least one path to kind of bide your time. In time, we can say that the situation in Gaza largely stabilizes. Starvation ceases, and miraculously, there is no major epidemic of disease in Gaza in 1948-1949. Now, all that said, this doesn't resolve the biggest problem, or the larger problem, which is what do we do with these refugees in the long term? We'll discuss this a little bit more in a moment, but the Egyptian government, while it is trying to help the refugees, while it is obviously giving them supplies, trying to kind of stabilize the situation, the Egyptian government doesn't want the refugees. The Egyptian government does not look at them and say, oh, these are poor, oppressed people. These are our brothers and sisters. Let us give them a permanent place to live. Let us accept them. Let us build them into Egyptian society. As is often the case, and this, by the way, goes back to all of those Jewish refugees that were trying to get out of Europe in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. mostly speaking, countries don't want refugees. Peoples don't want refugees because, as we said, they come in and compete for jobs. They may consume resources. And we're talking about the Jewish experience, 1930s. It's the Great Depression going on. You have all these people that need a job. You don't want to bring in more people that are going to need jobs. And so while the Egyptians are supportive of the Palestinians in the moment, the solution is not that they just all get Egyptian citizenship and just move to Cairo or Alexandria or other places. At least the Egyptians would say that's not the solution. So what is the future for these refugees in Gaza? And we'll talk about this more in just a moment. But one of the things that happens is that the refugees don't want to go live in Alexandria. They don't want to go live in Cairo. They don't want to become Egyptians. There is a real fear among the Palestinians. What happens if I, move to the United States? It'd be great in some respects, but there's not a lot of Palestinians here. There's not a lot of Arabs here even, outside of Michigan maybe. What if I lose my Palestinian identity? What if my children grow up and they start thinking of themselves as Saudis or Egyptians or French or whatever? The refugees don't want to become Egyptians. They want to go home. And so it is very hard to resolve the crisis without them going home. We'll come back and we'll talk more about this in just a second. Now, we also want to talk about Jordan. Initially speaking, there are some similarities between the refugee experiences in Gaza and Jordan and the West Bank. In the beginning, the first waves of flight from the Israeli section of Palestine are basically refugees of means. These are people who wish to escape, who hope that they can basically come back after a kind of temporary reprieve. Maybe the Arab armies will win the war. Maybe the Israeli government will collapse. Who knows? These better off refugees move especially to places like Amman, which is the capital of Jordan. When they get there, they don't arrive as we saw in Gaza, where a lot of these people are poor. They don't have a lot of money. They certainly don't have cash. But the people arriving in Amman, many of them do have money. And so instead of living in sort of tent cities or mud or brick houses, things like that, they will just rent a house. They'll rent a room. Now, as the fighting intensifies in the spring of 1948, there is a wave of these kind of poor peasants, villagers, people that are sometimes forcibly expelled by the Israelis, and they really don't, have a lot of ability to take their possessions with them. And so as these refugees arrive in Jordan or in the West Bank, which of course became part of Jordan, they are again largely welcomed by the local population. Now, a big part of this here is that the Jordanian government, led by King Abdullah, will take steps to reinforce the welcoming message. Abdullah not only wants to kind of do this for humanitarian grounds, as we've talked about in the past, but Abdullah wants the Palestinians to live in a Jordanian state. He wants to be seen as the champion of the Palestinian cause. He wants to take territorially the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem and incorporate it into his kingdom. As a result, the Jordanian government allows the incoming refugees to squat wherever possible. They try to facilitate, again, relocation in the first moments into mosques, schools, vacant dwellings, public places. Later on, they will start to identify areas for setting up internationally funded refugee camps, and many of these camps still exist today. The Jordanian government will also try to distribute relief funds. They will try to distribute supplies, food, medicine, things like that. Unfortunately, the Jordanian government is very poor. They don't have a lot of money, and they're also fighting a war at the time. And so they come up with a kind of brilliant idea, which is, we don't have the money to buy all the supplies, so let's ignore that for a moment. We'll become good at distribution. We'll let the international community give us the goods that the Palestinians need, and then we'll make sure that it gets to the people that need it. State media will also use this as kind of a propaganda moment. In particular, Abdullah makes personal donations to the refugees. And so, of course, they show this. Here's King Abdullah. He cares about you. He is trying to take care of you, etc. Now, more broadly speaking, as we talked about in our last episode, the broader Jordanian approach is different from virtually every other Arab state in that they do not look at the Palestinians as a problem, as a, hey, we hope you go back to Palestine one day, although they pay some lip service to that. But the Jordanian government actually wants to incorporate the refugees into the Jordanian state. The Jordanian government looks at the refugees as a positive, as a resource, as a benefit. And so they will take concrete actions to try to integrate the refugees into Jordanian society. By the end of 1949, most Palestinian refugees are offered the opportunity to take Jordanian citizenship. Now, this is a big deal not only because, well, okay, I've got a passport, I've got the right to live in Jordan legally, I've got the right to work in Jordan legally, but with citizenship comes a passport. And a passport means that I can cross the border and go somewhere else and know that I can come back at some point. In fact, if I am trying to cross the border into Iraq, let's say, and I have a passport, the Iraqi government will probably allow that or welcome me because they know that the Jordanian government is in some ways responsible for me. And so one of the things that happens almost exclusively for Jordanian refugees is that they are able to get passports and then go work in neighboring Iraq, where in the early to mid 1950s, we are starting to see a burgeoning oil industry. And oil pays. Palestinian refugees that wind up first in Jordan and getting Jordanian citizenship and then going to Iraq are going to be able to make money and send that money back home to take care of their loved ones. Palestinians in Gaza can't do this. Palestinians in Lebanon, for the most part, cannot do this. And so, again, for the ones who go to Jordan, life is almost always far better than it is in any other particular context. Now, Abdullah will also create state institutions to help the Palestinians. He creates a ministry for development and reconstruction. As we spoke about, when they have the first Jordanian parliament, they make it 50-50 in terms of guaranteed seats so that you'll have plenty of Palestinians there. Abdullah is very crafty, and one of the things that he realizes is, well, we've got all this labor supply here, and we have international aid agencies. They want to get these people working. What can we build? What makes a state stronger? Military bases. And so Abdullah will get members of the refugee community to work on building Jordanian military bases in the West Bank and other parts of Jordan. And of course, he pays them. The last thing I want to say about the official Jordanian response to this is that as all this is going on, the Jordanians are very careful to characterize what they're doing not as the integration or the absorption of the Palestinian refugees, but that basically they're helping out, quote, until the final settlement in Palestine, end quote. So they kind of try to set it up so that Palestinians can have a future in Jordan, but the door is still open to returning one day to Palestine. And so for the Palestinian refugees, this is a really big deal. They tend to like this. At any rate, to finish the story in Jordan, assisted by the United Nations, Jordanian authorities helped secure land for the new camps, coordinating the distribution of supplies and providing a police presence to ensure the well-being of the refugees. Now, they also kind of spy on the refugees a little bit. The Jordanians are a little concerned about too much, Palestinian nationalism could be a bad thing. But by February 1952, most of the refugees in Jordanian camps had transitioned to permanent homes. Now, there are some that still prefer tents, especially the Bedouin. The Bedouin are sort of nomadic tribesmen, so they'd much rather have a tent. You can move it around. But just to give you a sense of how much sort of progress had been made, in the Amman region, for example, 48,000 refugees lived in small homes built with corrugated iron, right? So they're strong. They're going to withstand the sun, withstand the winter, withstand the wind and the rain. About 10,000 of these refugees still live in tents. and about 1,900 remain in temporary barracks. The story from Nablus is similar. 97,000 refugees by this point had transitioned into permanent homes. 17,000 were still living in tents, and 5,400 were in barracks. So again, the crisis was not solved. There's still a tremendous amount of work to be done, but there had also been a lot of progress, one could argue, made by the time you get to 1949. In the end, about half of the Palestinian refugees in Jordan actually get integrated into the local community, take on Jordan citizenship, and about half of them will remain in the camps. Before concluding, we should point out that just like we saw in Gaza, the refugee issue in Jordan, even though the government is very open, very welcoming of the refugees, there are still challenges that they create for the local economy. In the West Bank, for example, where most of this sort of poor agrarian peasantry goes to, wages go down by about 50% or by as much as 50% due to increased competition, as we mentioned, for unskilled labor. At the same time, the opposite phenomenon takes place in the urban areas. Right? When we think about refugees, we usually think about the problem of being refugee need, or they come in, they consume resources, they need help. But as we mentioned, a lot of these refugees coming into Amman, they are actually better off. Right? When the Arab Bank moves its headquarters from Jerusalem to Amman, the bankers are not coming in destitute. And so you actually see the sort of opposite phenomenon happening. The bankers come in and inject a lot of money into the local economy. They're going to start buying and renting houses. They're going to start shopping. They're going to start, buying furniture and clothing and things like that. And so the issue here isn't too much supply, it's now too much demand. Where are you going to put all these people that suddenly want to buy a new house? So one of the problems that the Jordanians face in especially Amman is inflation, is competition in the housing market, is again this kind of injection of too much money into the economy. And so now we're going to get scarcity from the opposite side. It's not that we're not producing enough, it's that we've got too many people that want to buy things. Again, just to give you some numbers to kind of drive this point home, when World War II ends, Amman has a population of about 56,000 people. By 1952, so just 7 years later, it has almost quadrupled to 190,000 people. By 1962, 17 years after the end of the fighting, it is now 300,000 people. And it's not just Amman, it is many of the Jordanian cities. Nablus, for example, grows from 53 to 183,000. The population of Jenin doubles. Where are all these people going to live? How would you like it if all of a sudden people from New York City or California came to your neighborhood and started buying up your property, started buying your neighbor's property, started moving in, and the prices went up, and suddenly you get displaced? This is not a hypothetical. If you go, for example, to the beautiful town of Telluride in Colorado, starting about 10, 15 years ago, Telluride went from being this kind of sleepy, kind of nice, cool kind of place to live in Colorado in the mountains to a sort of destination. If you love skiing, Telluride is a great place to go. If you love relaxation, it's a great place to go. And all of a sudden, all these people from California, from New York, from other parts of the country started buying into Telluride. And the prices of real estate skyrocketed. And suddenly, if you're a school teacher, they're not paying you more or much more for schools. Can you afford to buy a house when your competition is a banker? And so if you go to Telluride today, you'll see actually that people that had lived there before all this happened, or younger people who are from the area that don't have family connections, they're moving out. There's kind of little almost towns that are springing up on the outskirts of Telluride. And if you go and talk to those people, they will tell you that they are not very happy about what has happened to their town, right? They feel displaced. Well, this is similar to what happens again in 1948, 49, 50 in Jordan, right? This creates tensions between the local population and the refugees. So in the short term, this assimilation, this fusion, if you will, between Palestinians and Jordanians, one could argue that it actually went off pretty well. Right? They are able to open up a future for these Palestinians. A lot of the refugees just decide to accept Jordanian citizenship. If you had to pick a place to go to in the Middle East, if you were a refugee, Jordan would probably be pretty high on most of the refugees list. However, in the long run, there are, as we said, problems. And one of the biggest problems becomes, what do we do about the Palestinians and their inability to return home? If you are the Jordanian government and you have secured control of the West Bank and you really like this and you want to keep it, and you're very satisfied to have the Temple Mount, what could endanger that? Well, one of the biggest dangers is the Israeli state that's just across the border. And so between 1948 and 1967, the Jordanians really don't want to fight the Israelis. There is some violence that happens. You'll have ceasefire violations, right? This is pretty normal. You'll also have these things called fedayin that are created where you have Palestinians who either want to return home or they want to kind of effect revenge, or they want to continue the conflict because maybe they'll win if it keeps going. And so the Jordanians find themselves in a really difficult situation. You have these Palestinians that are putting the security of the Jordanian state at risk by their continued desire to fight against Israel. You don't want that. And so now you're policing the Palestinians, but also kind of welcoming them. It is a tricky kind of situation for the Jordanian state to try to wrestle with. And it will become increasingly difficult after 1967 with the formation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. Once Palestinians decide to take their destiny, kind of militarily speaking, into their own hands again, then the places where they are basing this continuation of the war with Israel, there is a threat of drawing those countries further into the conflict. And so we see that directly in Jordan after 1967 until the PLO is basically expelled in the early 70s. And then we'll see it happen in Lebanon, where it goes on into the 1980s, right? The problem of what to do with Israel and Palestine does not just stay with Israel and Palestinians. It complicates the broader regional relationships. Okay, the last one that I want to talk about is Lebanon, which we just sort of mentioned, so this is a good kind of segue. If the Jordanians were welcoming, and the Egyptians were at least sympathetic, one could argue, to the Palestinians, the result of Palestinian flight and expulsion for Lebanon was deeply consequential and problematic. Unlike Jordan or Egypt, which by 1948 were largely ethnically homogenous societies, both Egypt and Jordan had existed, at least nominally, as independent states going back to at least the end of World War I. So you have some successful movements toward nation building. We'll talk about this more later in a separate podcast, but we'll talk about Nasser and kind of anti-colonialism and the way that kind of brings Egyptians together. But Lebanon in 1948 is a deeply divided society. We haven't talked a whole lot about Lebanon so far in the podcast, but Lebanon is not just a small Middle Eastern state, just like kind of all the others around it. Lebanon was essentially created in 1920, at least the modern kind of political state, by France in order to set up a religious minority-majority state. In other words, what that means is that it was historically a state that was dominated by the Christian Maronites, even though they weren't the majority population in the country. And of course, the French do this so that the Christian Maronites have to rely on them, right? When we're trying to figure out how do we do politics, how do we organize economically, tariffs, investment, all that kind of stuff, we want the French to be on our side so that we can continue to rule over the Muslims, or at least have political power, whereas the Muslims don't. To make the state viable from an economic standpoint, the French also kind of give it a little bit of coastal territory in the north, a little bit in the south. They give it a little bit in the east. There's a very fertile valley called the Bekaa. And this reduces the Christian Maronite population to about 30% of the state. Now, making this even more complicated, the Muslim population of Lebanon is not just Muslim, right? There are more distinctions beneath the surface, and the key one in the Middle East is the difference between Sunni and Shiite. It is a little bit akin to saying that you are Catholic or Protestant if you're more familiar with sort of Christian backgrounds. There are some additional minorities like the Druze that we talked about. If you're following the news in Syria today, right, the Syrian government just fell literally yesterday. One of the things you'll hear about is the Awalites, right? So that's another minority that's there. You have a bunch of Greek Orthodox people that live there as well. And so when Lebanon kind of experiences its big anti-colonial moment, when it becomes independent in 1943, the Lebanese agree to a kind of power-sharing deal that's meant to keep kind of relations sort of static, to create a kind of workable framework, right? So usually the president is going to be a Christian, but he is going to appoint a Muslim prime minister so that both communities feel that their voices are being heard. In addition, the seats in the national legislature are also divided on a 6-5 basis. The Maronites are going to have the majority, the political power, but we're going to make sure that the Muslim groups also have a voice, also feel like they have some buy-in into the state. When we set up our cabinet, we are not going to make the mistakes that one could argue when Arabs and Jews are negotiating over the British Mandate in the 1920s. One of the things that the Arabs had kind of insisted on was that they did not want to have a power-sharing deal for the cabinet, where there would be a certain number of Jews that were appointed in the cabinet, would never be a majority, but at least there's some sort of formal guarantee of representation. In Lebanon, they actually do this, and it tends to work out fairly well. So at the time of the first Arab-Israeli War, the Lebanese state is kind of in this sort of delicate ethno-political balancing act, right? It's working, but everybody's just kind of concerned about it a little bit. And then all of a sudden, 1948 happens, and you have, again, this large influx of Palestinian refugees that might upset that delicate balance. And so one of the reasons that the Lebanese react so differently, one could argue in kind of a more hostile way to the refugee issue, is that they are very concerned about what it's going to do to their own politics. And of course, as we've seen, starting in the 1970s and especially the early 80s, right, once the PLO ends up moving to Lebanon, it does incredibly complicate and blow up Lebanese politics, and it leads to a lot of suffering and death. I'm starting to get ahead of myself a little bit. Let me start by saying that when this initial wave of refugees reaches Lebanon, the reaction of the local population is somewhat similar to what we have seen in Gaza and Jordan. Refugees initially seek shelter wherever they can, and the local population tries to help them as best they can. A great example of this is one of the main refugee camps in Lebanon today, the Shatila camp, which basically begins when a Palestinian villager named Abed Bisher comes from Upper Galilee, and he's living in Beirut, and he's forced to move out of his apartment because he didn't have enough money to keep paying rent. And so he buys a tent, and he comes to a farm that's owned by the Shatila family, and he asks if he can live on land near their villa. So this is at the time on the outskirts of Beirut. And again, the local population initially is largely welcoming of the refugees. The family says, sure, please. And once he's established, Bisher begins to look for other members of his village that can settle alongside of him. Right? Let's create the village that we had in Palestine. It's just a little bit farther away. In 1950, the International Red Cross would officially recognize this area as being a camp, making it eligible for regular supplies and funding and things like that. At the time that they do this, there's only about 100 people living in Shatila, so it's very small. But over the course of time, the camp would grow into an entity of close to about 10,000 people. Now, this growth is slow, and one of the issues that they deal with is the fact that you can't just live in the 1950s in this camp and do whatever you want. There are restrictions that are placed upon it and upon the people there by the Lebanese government itself. Initially speaking, the Lebanese government says this is a temporary camp. You cannot build formal structures here. If you have a tent, you cannot reinforce the tent from the outside, even though we might have to deal with things like snow in the wintertime. So the population begins to get whatever they can. They get boards, they get lumber, things like that. They'll try to reinforce the tent from the inside. But as you can imagine, it's still not that easy to live. It's not as good as a permanent structure might be. In 1955, the refugees reached an agreement. They were allowed to reinforce the tents from the outside. And eventually, this kind of shanty town grows up alongside this kind of camp, and it's populated not just by refugees fleeing from Israel, but it is also people from other parts of Lebanon, from Syria. And it's only in the 1960s that the Lebanese government will allow people to start building permanent structures, permanent settlements, and buildings. If you go and look at pictures today of Shatila, it does not look like a tent city. It does not look like one might expect a refugee camp to look like. It looks like a slum. In fact, the city of Beirut has kind of grown into the refugee camp. So it's kind of like an oasis inside of the Lebanese capital, except oasis is probably too nice of a way of describing it. There's a lot more that we're going to say about Shatila later in this sort of series. One of the things that happens is that the PLO kind of takes it over in the 1970s. There's a lot of fighting in the 1980s during the Lebanese Civil War. There's more fighting in the 2000s during the Hezbollah-Israeli war. There's even more strikes that are going on most recently in the fall and early winter of 2024. But the key point, again, is that it underpins the complications of the refugee experience. Palestinian refugees in Lebanon neither return nor are integrated into the Lebanese state and society. They do not get the offer of Lebanese citizenship. They cannot go to Iraq or other places and work and send that money home. They do not receive Lebanese ID cards. They don't get work permits even within Lebanon itself. They don't receive access to government services such as education and healthcare. And while some Palestinians have been granted citizenship in the years since, the majority of the population still lives in a stateless limbo. And this has persisted for several generations. When you look at Lebanon today, one of the reasons that it is such a failed state, a damaged state, a problematic state, one of the problems is that it has had to deal with not only its own internal contradictions and sort of tensions, but also the enormous weight placed on it by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So much of the violence that we see today is linked to this kind of festering wound, if you will. Okay, I said I was going to get to the international community. I see that we're already at over an hour on this episode, and so I'm actually going to break this up and release it as 2 episodes. On our next episode, we'll focus on the international community's response to the refugee crisis. We'll talk about some of the resolutions. We'll talk about some of the problems and complications that came with the experience of kind of reacting to the refugee crisis. But that's going to be it for now. As always, I'd like to thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast, if you've found it useful, please feel free to mention us on social media, or you can also rate the show on Apple or Spotify. If you really like the episode and you want to support our show, or you want to see links to all the different types of episodes that we have, you can find that, as I said, on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. So again, that's going to be our show for now. Hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.